You are a smart, decent, normal person who just so happens to have been nominated to the highest court in our land. So here are the facts. Judge Kavanaugh is one of the most distinguished judges. Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to have this loudmouth removed.
R. Kelly, the self-proclaimed king of R&B, finally forced to face the music.
My body, my choice!
Cuts of millions of dollars in federal funding to any group that provides referrals or even procedures related to abortion.
Women across this nation smashed barriers in this year's historic midterm elections.
March on, my sisters! March on, my sisters! And remain strong! And remain strong!
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Couric, proud loudmouth. Welcome to day 2 of the summit and your feminist wake-up call. And we thought, what better way to kick off this morning than to take stock of the movement. It's been, as we all know, a roller coaster, from so many women breaking the silence with Me Too, to the turmoil of the Kavanaugh hearings, to the triumph of the midterm elections, to a renewed assault on abortion rights. So it's been a lot. I'm so excited to be giving these 4 loudmouths of the movement a megaphone. So please welcome Sarah McBride, spokesperson for the Human Rights Campaign and the first transgender person to address the political party's national convention. Ashley Judd, actor, author, and humanitarian and silence breaker. Good morning. Brittney Cooper, professor and author of Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower. Well done, Brittney. And finally, Rebecca Traister, writer for New York Magazine and author of Good and Mad. So we may hear a little anger here this morning. So Rebecca, you and Brittney are our resident historians, and you both, as I just mentioned, have released books on women and anger. So let's talk briefly about how we got here. Rebecca, let me start with you. Why did this movement, Me Too, Time's Up, and an overall awakening to so many of these issues? Why now? Why has it exploded with such a vengeance?
Well, I think that in order to think clearly about why people have awakened, you also need to look at who was asleep. And we like to tell a story in the United States of forward progress that is neat and finished. And so I think one of the things that happened, we tell ourselves that we're after the civil rights movement, that we're post-race, after the women's movement, that we're post-feminist, that we've solved the errors and inhumanity of our past. And then you have to think about who has the ability to believe this neat story. And it's generally going to be people who can take advantage of the progress, who can take advantage of, entrances into colleges and workplaces and an economy that had once prohibited them. It's people who have clean water to drink and access to health care and access to abortion and believe that it's just legal and available, when in fact we know that over the past 40 years it has become unavailable in so many places. It's people whose kids are not at risk of being shot by the police or likely to be incarcerated in their lives. And that is, in many cases when you're talking about women, middle-class white women, middle-class and privileged white women. And there's been an ease of believing that the problems were fixed. One of the things that's happened over the past couple years is that those women have been awakened in part because there was put on view a lot of privileged white women who were nonetheless losing even within the system that they'd gotten to the top of. And that is the loss of Hillary Clinton. That is many of the women who came forward and told their stories about Harvey Weinstein, who also happened to be privileged, wealthy, white women. It is Christine Blasey Ford. And there was a view of exactly what the continued limitations, which of course have been in place, nothing was actually fixed, but the degree to which inequality persists and defines so much about this country was made really clear to a population for whom it hadn't been clear for a while.
And in fact, Brittney, you often make an important observation that I think bears repeating here today about the genesis, the true genesis of this movement and the misleading narrative that's been constructed.
Yeah. So, look, I knew that we would have this moment of feminist movement building when we had an uprising in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And I knew it because history tells us that feminist movement building always follows movements for racial justice. If you look at the 19th century, you have black women and white women organizing around abolition in the 1830s. You have Mariah Stewart, who is the first black woman to ever speak before mixed race and gender audiences. And she's a black woman from Boston. So we give the credit for the women's movement to Seneca Falls in 1848, but really it starts with a black woman in the 1830s in Boston. Then Seneca Falls happens because white women are like, well, we're looking at how these enslaved folks are being treated, and there's much of our condition that is similar to theirs. And then if you fast forward to the 20th century, the same thing happens again. You have folks who are organizing on behalf of civil rights, including white women who are coming down to the South in the summer of 1964. They're observing what's happening with black folks, and all of a sudden they say, wait, we are also stuck in these conundrums in our lives, and we don't have full freedom. And then you get the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s. The same thing happens again in the 2010s. In 2014, 3 black women galvanized this country to fight back against police killings of unarmed black people. They do this with a specific and inclusive focus on queer black folks, trans black folks, and they say we're going to get this one thing right about the 60s, which is we're going to have a gender-forward movement for black liberation. They're feminist, and they claim feminism. And then after that, when Donald Trump is elected, this is why white women know what to do. Because for the this is why they know, right? Because for the better part of a decade, they've been watching folks around the country rise up and say, we will not deal with these injustices. And so it doesn't take anything away from our movements to be reminded that when oppressed folks rise up, the reason that we want that to happen is because it clarifies our condition and it gives us a vision for who we could be if we were willing to fight for it.
Ashley, you know, actually, this follows really well because, Ashley, you were instrumental in bringing greater attention to the issue of sexual harassment, waking up white women, middle-class white women, I think, in many ways, as Rebecca might say, because you were the first to go on the record about Harvey Weinstein in 2017. You allowed the New York Times to print your name, which was a really big deal. Why did that feel right to you?
Thank you. By the way, if you like a little bit of this, you can get a lot of that by watching these two on YouTube. It's a highly wonderful way to spend an afternoon. You know, I actually told the story about Harvey's sexual harassment of me the moment after it happened. My dad was with me, and I came down to the hotel lobby, and he still says today he could tell by the look on my face that something devastating had happened. And I am a loudmouth. I mean, we fight, flight, or freeze, and I'm a fighter, and one of the ways I fight and get big is I talk. So I told everybody about it, but no one was able or willing to listen.
When was that?
That was in June of 1996. And then in Variety magazine, exactly 2 years before Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey's incredible piece ran, I told the story in great detail, and it was printed first-person narrative, and I just let it sit, and nobody did anything with it. But it all came together with Jodi and Megan's piece, and I'm very thankful it did. I really appreciate the way everyone is with me. I mean, the notes you pass me on airplanes, the way you say hi to me when I go to the mall with my mom, it means a lot. And, you know, the lawsuit in which we're involved is for everybody, and everyone's been talking about whether or not the sexual harassment piece has been dismissed, but it's actually going to be heard by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And what that language is about is whether or not, as a producer, it was criminal for him to sexually harass me. It's not disputed whether or not he did. Even he admits to that. And so it's wonderful that it's being heard by the Court of Appeals, and the defamation, the unfair competition, and interference with my economic opportunity are still going to trial.
And you talk about how you're doing this for a lot, as you just mentioned, a lot of women, not just for Hollywood women.
Absolutely. Yes, and everything that we're doing at Time's Up, which is so generative, the Be Heard Act, which was just introduced in the House of Representatives, is about ending workplace discrimination and increasing accountability for independent contractors, for people who are employed by companies that have fewer than 15 employees, ending the $2.13 minimum wage for tipped workers, ending mandatory arbitration, and also doing the first ever comprehensive national survey of sexual harassment. All of that is included in the Be Heard Act. And then, of course, there's the Paycheck Fairness Act. We lose $900 billion a year due to income disparity between men and women.
Meanwhile, Sarah, you have shared your own Me Too experience, but I know in doing so, you were very concerned about how your story would be received. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been an evolution over the last few years since, obviously, the Me Too movement started before the fall of 2017 with Tarina Burke and so many other advocates. But when it bubbled up in the fall of 2017, I think one of the things that we saw, because it was an organic bubbling up, was that people sort of assumed that it would be this natural space where everyone had an equal opportunity to share their stories. But I think a lot of voices of color, LGBTQ voices, women living in poverty, didn't feel the same ability to share their stories. And I think we all come to this conversation with different perspectives and different identities that we bring to the table that might add extra barriers. And for me as a transgender person, in addition to the sort of issue-wide disbelief of survivors, I also was concerned, like so many other, I think, women and so many other people, that as a trans person, since society always sends the message that there are a few things more disgusting than my body, that people would go, well, no one would sexually assault you because you're trans. I also came to that issue and came to the question of should I share my story, because as an advocate, and I think this is true for so many women, as an advocate, I worried that in sharing my story, it would sexualize me in a way that would make it so that people would no longer hear the points that I was trying to make on a whole host of issues. And then finally, and I think this is particularly poignant for the trans community, right now we are seeing, as we are pushing forward trans rights, so many opponents of equality use myths and caricatures around sexual assault and predators to block progress for trans people. We see when we try to pass protections, they talk about bathrooms and predators, and they paint transgender people into a threat to public safety. And so my concern too was people wouldn't hear my story, they'd hear transgender and sexual assault in the same sentence, and instead of hearing my experience and recognizing that trans people are more likely to be survivors of sexual assault, that they would just immediately go to that myth around predators. But at the end of the day, it was important for me to share my story, and I wanted to make sure in sharing my story that I helped to educate people as this conversation was happening about these intersecting barriers. And obviously my whiteness, my economic privilege, so many other aspects allowed me to do that. And I think it's so important that as we have this conversation, we recognize that we have to be intentional about creating space and support and structures for everyone to have their voices heard.
Well, you're an excellent teacher, because I've talked to you many times about these issues, and I know initially you were concerned about transphobia and didn't really realize how concerning misogyny was going to be.
Yeah, so, I think it's so important when we have these conversations to recognize that my experience before I transitioned wasn't exactly the same as a cisgender, which means non-transgender man, but there was no question that there were privileges that I experienced before I came out and transitioned. And I was always someone who tried to think about the sexism and the misogyny in the world. And I think I was so consumed with the transphobia that would come my way, I didn't fully wrap my mind around just how pervasive and just how constant and just how many double standards there would be, that you're treated like both a delicate infant and a sexualized idol in the exact same moment. I didn't realize just how disempowering it would be as both a woman and as a trans person to have a stranger feel entitled to comment on my body. And I always like to say I came out of the closet only to find myself stuck in the kitchen.
Wow. Wow.
Brittney, coming off the power of Me Too, I think the Kavanaugh hearings felt like such a setback. What was the lesson there, if there was one? Brittney.
Okay. Look, so during the Kavanaugh hearings, I tweeted that that the conflict of being a black woman watching those hearings was that I was relying on the power of white girl tears to actually compel this nation to do something, and learning in the exact same moment that while white women often weaponize their tears against folks, look, when we call y'all out for racism and then y'all start crying, that's weaponizing your tears, because you're the perpetrator, we're the victims, and somehow everybody starts talking about what's wrong with you, right? Stop doing that shit. Stop doing it, right? But we needed Christine Blasey Ford to be heard, to be believed. She was literally the most kind of upstanding white woman you will ever see. Very well educated, from a particular class of white folks, very sort of poised. And yet, those white men trounced all over her like she was nobody and like she was standing in the way of them getting the keys to the kingdom, which she kind of was. And so what I hoped white women learned in that moment was that the lesson of 2016, when the majority of white women voters voted for the current person in the White House, is that you can't get in bed with white supremacy without also getting in bed with patriarchy. And so you can't decide that you want to have proximity and access to the power and money and influence that white men have without realizing that you are stepping into the lion's den willingly, and that if you don't play nice, if you do call them out, then they will come for you too, right? That's true. And the problem was that the rest of us knew, look, the thing that I know as a black woman in this country is that if white women's tears can't compel any kind of moral compunction for white men, what do you think that means for the rest of us? Right.
And that was yet another wake-up call, Rebecca, for these middle-class white women that you were talking about.
Right. Well, I think there are a couple things that I think about listening to Brittney and thinking about that moment. The first is I, like many of us, thought a lot about the comparison between Christine Blasey Ford and Anita Hill, who testified 27 years earlier, and who had been treated wretchedly by many of the same men who were still sitting on the Judiciary Committee 27 years later.
Yep.
And Anita Hill had been treated as an African-American, unmarried woman, albeit with an advanced degree, and a peer of the man she was testifying against, who still sits on the Supreme Court, where he has gutted the Voting Rights Act and all kinds of protections that we have historically been reliant on. Yep. She was treated with disrespect, derision, talked about as a fantasist and as mentally ill and as a sexual obsessive by these white men. And for a long, you thought, okay, in part, she has written about how this was because she was unmarried, disassociated from the institution that made women comprehensible, that she was black. Well, here's Christine Blasey Ford, 27 years later, a middle-class, married white woman from the same elite circle as the man she's telling a story about, and she is treated, frankly, with only a degree less of disrespect, because they tried. They basically came as close as they could to saying that she was a little bit slutty and a little bit nutty, which is the line that they used which is what they said about Anita Hill. They said Christine Blasey Ford was a little bit confused about who her attacker had been. And I'm sitting there thinking about this, and I'm enraged, and then I'm thinking, wait a minute, both of these women are women with advanced degrees. Both of these women are social and professional peers. What about the legions of women who could never even get in, and they're treated terribly and ultimately not believed, and the men are elevated anyway? What about the legions of women who do not have advanced degrees, who are not in the circles, who would never even be permitted in that room? The waiters, the cocktail waitresses, the factory workers, the teacher, the people who could never have been brought into that room to begin with, who, believe me, have been sexually harassed and probably assaulted by exactly the kinds of men who have historically sat on the Supreme Court. And those voices would never even get into that room. Those two women have every credential possible to make their voices heard, and they're still not heard. And then think about the millions of women who would never even be able to tell the story. So that is one thing that I took away from that hearing. And the second is the defeat people felt. There had been this 2 years, the Women's March, the teachers' strikers, Me Too, the pressure applied to the Senate that actually stopped the repeal of Obamacare, where it had felt like once those women had woken up, once women who'd been kind of somnambulant had woken up, it was like, yeah, we can do this. There'd been win after win after win. And that was a cold bucket of water. And it's like, right, the very powerful, the white patriarchy that has power, that this country was built by and around, still has the power to defeat this. And that was a real, I think, wake-up call again about exactly how steep these barriers are for us.
You know, I can't talk about the status of the movement without getting you all to give me your quick take. I'm going to give you 30 seconds each on Joe Biden. And you're going to watch Rebecca's head explode because she has a lot to say about this, but I told her in advance, 30 seconds. Go.
My 30-second take on Joe Biden is that the stories about the inappropriate touching are important because what they display is a kind of paternalism that is actually key to the kinds of policy that he has made in his 50 years in political power and as a leading member of the Democratic Party. And it is not just Joe Biden, it's a lot of what the Democratic Party has chosen to do. It is a paternalistic approach that is visible in his policy record around abortion, around integration, around crime, and that is why the stories of the touching are relevant, because they take us directly to the way he has governed and his view of the role of government and power over the bodies of those who are governed.
Excellent. Okay, Brittney, go ahead.
Look, I don't trust Uncle Joe. I know he loved Barack Obama, but that was after he called the man clean and articulate and was very surprised that a Harvard Law graduate and a former state senator would be clean and articulate. He got away with that, and the challenge is that why does he keep getting a pass? He humiliated Anita Hill. Go back on a day when you're watching YouTube and watch the way that he talked to her in those hearings. That's who he actually is. The slip-ups that he has, we give him this credit for these sort of avuncular gaffes. He doesn't deserve that. And look, if Hillary Clinton didn't make it into office because people thought that she was untrustworthy because of her advocacy for many of the policies her husband signed into law in the 90s when she didn't have any political power, who do you think was the major architect of things like the crime bill? If she can't be in office, he certainly can't be in office. He will not save us. He is not the future. And the thing I want folks in this audience to know, and you can call it terrible identity politics if you want to, I'm sorry though, the future is female. It is not an old white man. Let's mix it up.
All right, Ashley.
I'll make a plug so that Rebecca gets more than her 30 seconds. She wrote a great piece about this on The Cut, which you can read in its entirety.
Yeah, you definitely should read it.
It's wonderful.
That's right, read it.
And I would also mention a piece that Sophia Karasek wrote. She's the one who's in that famous picture that went viral of Vice President Biden and she with their heads together at the Oscars. She wrote a piece about that moment and how it was both unwelcome and then something for which she was lauded, and she put it up in her house, but it made her uncomfortable, and how did she really feel about it? And what I would say for me is that I'm very uncomfortable looking at those images, and they do feel paternalistic and condescending, and democracy starts at my skin. The reach of the state stops at my body, and that includes the folks who are in elected power, and it's very simple. Just ask. Just ask, especially when we're talking about, Uncle Joe and our relatives who come for Thanksgiving, and we're teaching, even the Girl Scouts is teaching little girls these days, you have the right to say no to any hug or touch or approach from an adult that doesn't feel right for you. We need our bodily autonomy and sexual integrity.
All right. Sarah.
Yeah, I'm from Delaware, and everyone in Delaware has dated, mated, or related to one another. I worked for Joe Biden's son. I consider Joe Biden a dear friend. I think that this conversation, has helped to further the fact for a lot of people that intentions aren't the be-all and end-all of a conversation. That you can have good intentions, you can mean well, but that doesn't necessarily mitigate harm, discomfort, or people being entitled to share that discomfort and that harm. So I think it's a really important conversation. I think it's also reflective of these broader conversations that we're having right now as progressives, as Democrats, as women, as people who are engaged in politics in general, as to what room is there for growth and grace and forgiveness and accountability. And I think we're working through that. And I think people have to figure out where that line is drawn. And I'm not saying that his is on any one side of that or the other, but I think we are having a broader conversation around that. And I do think it's important for us to continue to have that conversation. And I hope there's ability for nuance and to have that conversation in the context of a presidential race.
Sarah, can I say one thing? I agree with you because I don't believe in sort of punitive measures. But I'm actually not interested in a conversation about growth and grace until folks are willing to admit what they did. Say what you did. Say that it caused harm. Say that you didn't know any better. Say that you could have done better. Say that you're listening. But see, the thing that we do, particularly to women and to minority folks when they begin to talk about harms, I'm not saying that you said this. I think you called for nuance, and I think that is correct. But I think the problem is that those of us who are saying you better reckon with what you did are seen as people who lack nuance. And look, I have nuance every time I don't cuss you out when you do a microaggression towards me. Right? That's my nuance showing up to honor your humanity and to say that maybe there are things that are redeemable about you. But we put the burden of being nuanced on the people who are most vulnerable to being harmed, and then we let folks skate on accountability because there are places in their lives where they are good people. And if any of us are honest, what we know is that good people can do very bad things. And we got to be able to hold people accountable for that and stop trying to make folks into saints and stop trying to make the folks who call them out into demons.
Yeah, right? I absolutely agree with that. And I think that people are engaging this. I think all of the conversations have engaged with this in the degree of nuance that it deserves. And I think you're absolutely right that there can only be grace and forgiveness as long as there's first accountability and demonstration of growth. And in my life, my perspective, look, if as a trans person, if I required every person who I'm willing to stand with to have been perfect from the start, I'd have practically no one standing by my side.
That's right.
And so I am willing to demonstrate grace and forgiveness as long as people first are willing to demonstrate that they're not going to take that grace and forgiveness for granted. They're not going to abuse it. They're not going to allow it to just sit there and then not change their behavior. Right. There has to be growth and accountability before that grace and that forgiveness is demonstrated.
That's right. You're right.
We're almost out of time, but I want to run through a couple of other things about what we need to stay loud about. Ashley, you signed on to the Hollywood boycott of Georgia after they passed that fetal heartbeat bill, which would ban abortion when a heartbeat can be heard around 6 weeks. It's starting to feel a little like The Handmaid's Tale, isn't it?
It is, and what I like to talk about is my personal experience with abortion, because as everyone knows, and I'm very open about it, I'm a 3-time rape survivor, and one of the times I was raped, there was conception, and I'm very thankful I was able to access safe and legal abortion, because that rapist, who is a Kentuckian, as am I, and I reside in Tennessee, has paternity rights in Kentucky and Tennessee. I would have had to co-parent with a rapist. And so having safe access to abortion was personally important to me. And as I said earlier, democracy starts with our skin. We're not supposed to regulate what we choose to do with our insides. And I'm very encouraged by seeing lots of other states who are coming forward and saying we're pro-choice, we're pro-woman, come do business with us, and I would be happy to.
Although Texas, pretty scary. A group of legislators want to execute women who have abortions and the doctors who provide them.
It's bananas. I mean, what is there to say? I'm speechless about that sort of thing. And the control of women's reproductive health and sexuality is one of the global scourges. I'm very happy to work with UNFPA, which advocates the sexual and reproductive health of girls and women around the world. I've been to 22 countries doing this work, and it's an essential, integral, critical part of the fight, and we have to be indefatigable.
Sarah, meanwhile, you've been fighting hard for the Equality Act, which seems like such a no-brainer. It adds LGBTQ rights to existing civil rights legislation. I think people would be shocked to hear how little protection there is. And I think like 30 states, right, Sarah?
That's right. People broadly think that discrimination is illegal across the country, but the reality remains that in a majority of states and at the federal level, LGBTQ people still do not have clear protections from discrimination, which means you can be fired from your job, kicked out of a restaurant, or denied housing simply because of your gender identity or sexual orientation. And so the Equality Act, which was legislation that was first introduced in 2015 and was reintroduced just a few weeks ago in the US Congress, would fill the gaps in our nation's federal civil rights laws by adding gender identity and sexual orientation to our nation's pre-existing civil rights laws, while also enhancing and expanding protections for people of color, women, and people of faith.
Is it likely to pass in this current climate?
Well, it's definitely going to pass the US House. We have more co-sponsors at introduction than we need to actually pass the bill, but it's got an uphill battle in the US Senate with Mitch McConnell, and it's certainly got an uphill battle with this current president. And so it's a reminder of the need to make sure that we have a pro-equality president when 2021 comes around. But I also think it's so important that even if we pass these laws, and I think what we have seen time and time again, to I think Brittney's point earlier, is that people think that after an inflection point in a movement that we've actually dealt with the issues. And even if we pass this law, there's going to be significant work that remains in opening hearts and changing minds and making sure that our laws reflect our values, but also our individual behavior reflects our values. And I think also to Brittney's point, that we have to remember in this moment, I think so often people can dismiss conversations around gender and LGBTQ rights and racial justice as issues that will over time evolve. But I think we need people to feel a sense of urgency. Because one, there is a unique dehumanization in having to constantly, over and over and over again, explain that you are a person, that you are worthy of being treated with kindness and respect, and that every single time we ask LGBTQ people or women or people of color or Muslims or immigrants or people living at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities, every single time we ask them to sit back and allow for that slow conversation to take place before we treat them with kindness and respect, we are asking people to watch their one life pass by without the dignity and the fairness that every person deserves, and that's too much to ask of anyone.
So, we're about out of time. Brittney, I'm going to let you bring it home. You've said that we don't do enough to articulate why each and every one of us needs feminism. So why don't you do that for us today?
Yeah. Look, everyone thinks about feminism as a thing that takes something from us. But what I know is that feminism adds to your life because it gives you language to think about your social condition. So it helps you that when your boss is being unnecessarily harassing or undermining you at work, and then you say, is that happening? Feminism says, yes, girl, it is happening, and gives you the language to fight back. It gives you the language so that your partner knows how to show up for you in ways that are not sexist, right? And that are not about ownership, but that are rooted in care, that are rooted in notions of equality. If you're out here in the world being a badass and then you're still expected to come home, wash the dishes, take care of the kids, and still be sexy, like at all times, feminism has language for that. We call that the second or the third shift, and we need to critique it, and we need to have a conversation about whether you should be being compensated at home for all this extra labor that you're doing, right? So there's that. Right? But feminism also gives us the language to think about how we can be unified with each other. I know that it's easy these days to sort of talk about white girls and white girl tears, but look, part of what we're trying to say is that patriarchy is a real problem, and that in the end, we know that men across the power spectrum are interested in being dominant, unless they are not. And so feminism gives you the language to raise your sons better, to, if you are straight, to be better partners, if you aren't straight, to make sure you don't reproduce patriarchy even in queer partnership, but it also gives you the language to say, how do we show up and fight together for the world we want to build? It is feminists of color who've been saying, let's be intersectional. All the pieces of you matter. We can leave none of these systems behind. We don't get to be single issue people. And so feminism, it's fun. You get to dance to Beyonce. You know what I mean? She's on the squad. I think that that's a win. And, you know, we get to have an affirmative vision of who we're trying to be. And who we're trying to be is not people that say that other folks don't matter or that they're not relevant anymore, but that the future that we want, and in fact the only one that is sustainable, is the one in which we all get to go together. And that means that justice has to be our beacon and our guide for how to do that. Feminism talks about that. That's why I'm a feminist, even when a lot of black folks aren't. And that's why I will be out here in a brown pussy hat fighting alongside you guys.
Ladies, you're amazing. Rebecca, Brittney, Ashley, Sarah, ladies, loudmouths, thank you.